Taiwan. On the 1st of October 1949, Beijing, China. Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government he had just defeated fled across the Taiwan Strait to the island of Taiwan, 180 kilometers away. Both sides claimed to be the legitimate government of all of China. The world eventually recognized Beijing. Taiwan kept governing itself anyway. China has never governed Taiwan. The island has run its own military, its own elections, and its own economy for over 75 years. Beijing calls it a rogue province that must be reunified, by force if necessary. In 2024 and again in 2025, Beijing dropped the word peaceful from its annual government work reports on Taiwan, no longer committing in writing to a non-military path. In December 2025, China deployed over 90 ships around Taiwan in formations simulating blockade operations. The U.S. responded with an $11 billion arms deal with Taipei. This is the dispute most analysts consider most likely to produce a major war in the coming decade. Kashmir. On the 14th of August 1947, the Indian subcontinent, the British Empire ended. In the chaos of partition, the borders of South Asia were drawn in weeks. The princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, Muslim majority, ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, was told to choose India or Pakistan. It tried to choose neither. Pakistan invaded. The Maharaja signed accession to India. The First Indo-Pakistani War had begun before the ink was dry. Today, India controls roughly 55% of the region, Pakistan 30%, and China the remaining 15%. 3 nuclear powers. 1 valley. No resolution in 77 years. In April 2025, the dispute erupted again. Gunmen attacked tourists in Pahalgam in Indian-administered Kashmir, killing 26 people. India blamed Pakistan-backed militant groups. Pakistan denied it. On May 7th, India launched strikes deep into Pakistani territory, the first time the two countries had used drones to strike one another. Pakistan retaliated. A ceasefire, reached directly between the two countries with U.S. officials playing a supporting role, halted the fighting on May 10th. The ceasefire held. The dispute did not end. The South China Sea. In 1947, Nanking, China, the nationalist government of China drew a line on a map, an 11-dash line encircling nearly the entire South China Sea, claiming it as Chinese historical waters. The communists who replaced them inherited the claim and trimmed it to 9 dashes. The line has no basis in international law. It overlaps the territorial waters of 6 other nations. China has never stopped asserting it. The claimants are Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. An estimated $3 trillion in global trade passes through these waters annually, above billions of barrels of oil and vast reserves of natural gas. China has spent years physically building its position, piling sand onto reefs, constructing artificial islands, installing military bases and airstrips on features that barely broke the surface of the water. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled almost entirely in the Philippines' favor. China declared the ruling null and void and has ignored it ever since. Within the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands are its most active flashpoint. More than 100 small islands, reefs, and submerged features scattered across the Southern Sea, claimed in whole or in part by 6 governments. China has transformed its occupied features into fortified military outposts with runways, port facilities, and weapons systems. Every month, some new incident occurs here. A water cannon fired, a vessel rammed, a military aircraft buzzing another country's ship. Separate from the Spratlys, the Paracel Islands were seized from South Vietnam by force in 1974. 19 Vietnamese sailors were killed. China has controlled them ever since, building military infrastructure across the chain, including a runway and missile systems. Vietnam has never stopped protesting. In September 2025, China declared a nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal, a feature the Philippines also claims. Both Manila and Washington rejected the declaration as unlawful. Confrontations between Chinese and Philippine vessels have become routine, involving water cannons, laser systems, and deliberate collisions. Ukraine. On the 27th of February, 2014, Crimea, Ukraine. Russian soldiers in unmarked uniforms, quickly dubbed Little Green Men, seized the parliament building in Simferopol and raised the Russian flag. Within weeks, Russia had annexed Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula it had administered as Soviet territory until 1954. The UN General Assembly voted 100-11 that the annexation was illegal. Russia vetoed every Security Council resolution condemning it and has administered Crimea as Russian territory ever since. Ukraine has not recognized it. The West has not recognized it. 8 years later, on the 24th of February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion, the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Russian forces pushed toward Kyiv, bombed cities across the country, and seized large swaths of the south and east. Ukraine held. Kyiv did not fall. The front line has ground back and forth ever since. Russia has declared 4 Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, annexed into the Russian Federation. It does not fully control any of them. Ukraine has not surrendered any of them. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have died, and the war continues. Whether Crimea ever returns to Ukraine is one of the most consequential unresolved territorial questions of the current era. Western Sahara. On the 14th of November, 1975, Madrid, Spain. Spain signed the Madrid Accords and walked away from its colony on the northwest coast of Africa. It handed administrative control to Morocco and Mauritania without asking the people who lived there. The local independence movement, the Polisario Front, backed by Algeria, immediately went to war. Mauritania gave up in 1979. Morocco did not. Morocco built a 2,700-kilometer sand and stone wall through the Sahara, one of the longest military structures ever built, dividing the territory. Behind it, Morocco controls roughly 80% of Western Sahara. On the other side, the Polisario controls a barren desert strip from which tens of thousands of Sahrawi refugees have been waiting for a referendum on independence for over 50 years, living in camps in Algeria. That referendum was promised in 1991 as part of the UN ceasefire deal. It has never happened. In October 2025, the UN Security Council referenced Morocco's autonomy proposal as a basis for negotiations, effectively moving the goalposts away from full independence. The Polisario rejected it. Low-level fighting continues along the berm. The Falkland Islands. On the 2nd of April 1982, Stanley, Falkland Islands. Argentine special forces landed before dawn and seized the islands Britain had administered since 1833. Argentina called them the Malvinas. Britain sent a naval task force 13,000 kilometers south. 74 days later, Argentina surrendered. 900 people were dead. Britain kept the islands. The war ended. The dispute did not. Argentina has never relinquished its claim. In April 2026, President Javier Milei declared he was doing everything humanly possible to return the Falklands to Argentina, claiming unprecedented diplomatic progress. The timing was notable. A leaked Pentagon memo suggested the Trump administration might reassess its historic support for British sovereignty, part of a package of retaliatory measures being considered against London for refusing to join US-led military operations against Iran. Britain's response was immediate. The UK government stated its position was steadfast and consistent. The islanders themselves voted 99.8% to remain British in a 2013 referendum. The dispute is frozen but alive, and for the first time in decades, the geopolitics around it have shifted. The Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. On the 8th of September, 1951, San Francisco, California, Japan signed the post-war peace treaty, renouncing territorial claims it had acquired through conquest. The treaty did not explicitly assign sovereignty over a small cluster of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. For 2 decades, nobody much cared. Then oil and gas reserves were discovered underneath the seabed in 1969, and everyone started caring enormously. Japan controls the islands and calls them the Senkaku. China claims them and calls them the Diaoyu. Taiwan also claims them. The islands have no permanent inhabitants, just rocks, reefs, and fishing grounds. Japan and China have never signed a peace treaty formally ending World War II, partly because of this dispute. Chinese Coast Guard and naval vessels routinely enter the waters Japan considers its territory. In February 2026, 4 Chinese vessels entered Japanese territorial waters near the islands before departing after approximately 2 hours, a now routine pattern of incursion and withdrawal designed to assert claims without triggering direct confrontation. The United States has explicitly stated that the islands fall under the US-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, meaning any Chinese military move could trigger a direct American military response. The Korean Peninsula. On the 27th of July, 1953, Panmunjom, Korea. An armistice was signed, halting the Korean War after 3 years and roughly 2.5 million deaths. It was not a peace treaty. Technically, the war never ended. The peninsula remains divided at the 38th parallel, one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth. North Korea has built nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them. South Korea hosts 28,500 American troops. Both governments still officially claim sovereignty over the entire peninsula. North Korea periodically fires missiles over Japanese territory. South Korea and the United States conduct joint military exercises that Pyongyang calls rehearsals for invasion. The cycle has repeated for 70 years. The border has not moved. Abkhazia and South Ossetia. On the 26th of August 2008, Moscow, Russia. 5 days after Russian forces defeated Georgia in a brief war, Russia formally recognized both South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. Almost no one else did. Today, 4 countries recognize them. The other 193 members of the United Nations do not. Both territories broke away from Georgia in wars in the early 1990s, backed by Russia. Russian troops remain stationed in both. Georgia calls them occupied territories and has spent years pushing toward European integration and NATO membership. Russia's answer has been to keep 2 pieces of Georgia under permanent military occupation. Transnistria. On the 2nd of September 1990, Tiraspol, Moldova, a narrow strip of land on the eastern bank of the Dniester River, declared itself a republic. Moldova had just declared independence from the Soviet Union. The people of Transnistria, largely Russian and Ukrainian-speaking, more connected to Moscow than Chisinau, refused to go along. A brief war in 1992 ended in a ceasefire. Russian troops have been there ever since. Transnistria does not exist on any official map. No UN member state recognizes it, and yet it functions. It has its own currency, its own border guards, its own passport, and Soviet-era statues of Lenin still lining its streets. Moldova has spent 30 years trying to reintegrate it. It has not succeeded. Gibraltar. On the 4th of August, 1704, southern Spain. British forces seized a rocky peninsula at the entrance to the Mediterranean during the War of the Spanish Succession. Spain ceded it formally in 1713. Spain has wanted it back ever since. Gibraltar is 6.7 square kilometers of rock with about 32,000 people living on it. It controls the entrance to the Mediterranean. Britain has administered it for over 300 years. In a 2002 referendum, 98% of Gibraltarians voted to remain British. Spain has never dropped its claim. Brexit made things worse. Gibraltar voted 96% to remain in the EU, and its land border with Spain suddenly became an EU external border overnight. The dispute is not violent, but it is not resolved either. The Kuril Islands. On the 18th of August, 1945, North Pacific. Soviet forces invaded the Kuril Islands, a chain stretching between Japan and Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, in the final days of World War II. Japan had controlled the islands since the 19th century. The Soviet Union took them, expelled the Japanese population, and resettled the islands with Soviet citizens. Japan has never accepted this. It calls the 4 southernmost islands, Kunashir, Iturup, Shikotan, and the Habomai Islets, the Northern Territories, and considers them illegally occupied. Russia calls them the Southern Kurils and considers the matter settled by the outcome of World War II. Because of this dispute, Japan and Russia have never signed a formal peace treaty ending the war, making the Kurils one of the last unresolved legal remnants of a conflict that ended 80 years ago. Cyprus. On the 20th of July, 1974, Northern Cyprus. Turkish forces invaded Cyprus following a coup backed by the Greek military junta that sought to unite the island with Greece. Within weeks, Turkish forces controlled 37% of the island. Greek Cypriots fled south. Turkish Cypriots fled north. In 1983, the Turkish-controlled north declared itself the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Only Turkey recognizes it. The UN considers the declaration legally invalid. Cyprus joined the European Union in 2004, making it the only EU member with a large part of its territory under foreign military occupation. Reunification talks have collapsed repeatedly, the last serious attempt failing in 2017. The island remains divided by a UN buffer zone, the Green Line, running straight through the capital Nicosia. Israel, Palestine, and the occupied territories. On the 29th of November, 1947, New York City, the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Jewish leaders accepted. Arab leaders rejected it. The day after Israel declared independence in May 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded. Israel won and ended up controlling more territory than the partition plan had assigned it. In June 1967, in 6 days of fighting, it captured the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. It has controlled the West Bank and Gaza ever since. The West Bank through military occupation and settlements, Gaza through blockade and periodic war. The Palestinian Authority nominally administers parts of the West Bank. Hamas has controlled Gaza since 2007. Neither represents a functioning Palestinian state. Israel has continued to expand settlements in the West Bank, which the international community considers illegal under international law. The two-state solution has become increasingly theoretical as the physical facts on the ground make it harder to achieve. The Golan Heights, annexed from Syria in 1981, were declared null and void by the UN Security Council until 2019, when the United States became the first country to formally recognize Israeli sovereignty over them. The territory remains occupied. The conflict continues. Nagorno-Karabakh. On the 19th of September 2023, Karabakh, Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan launched a 24-hour military operation and ended nearly 35 years of Armenian control over Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous enclave inside Azerbaijan populated for centuries by ethnic Armenians. Within days, over 100,000 Armenians fled. The Armenian population of Karabakh effectively ceased to exist in a matter of weeks. The dispute had begun in 1988, when the Soviet Union was collapsing and the enclave tried to break away. It produced a full-scale war in the early 1990s, a ceasefire, 26 years of frozen conflict, a 6-week war in 2020, and finally the decisive offensive of 2023. Azerbaijan now controls the entire territory. This is one of the few disputes in this list that effectively ended in Azerbaijan's favor within the last 2 years. West Papua. On the 1st of May 1963, West New Guinea. Indonesia took administrative control of the western half of the island of New Guinea from the Netherlands, which had retained it when Indonesia declared independence in 1945. In 1969, a vote was held, the Act of Free Choice, in which 1,025 hand-picked representatives unanimously chose integration with Indonesia. The UN noted the result. Critics called it the Act of No Choice. The indigenous Papuan population has resisted Indonesian rule ever since. A low-level independence movement has operated for decades. Indonesia has responded with military operations, restrictions on foreign journalists, and the settlement of large numbers of non-Papuan Indonesians in the region. It is one of the least covered territorial disputes in the world, involving the violent suppression of a people who never consented to the government that controls them. Ceuta and Melilla. On the northern coast of Africa, 2 Spanish cities sit entirely surrounded by Moroccan territory. Ceuta and Melilla have been Spanish for over 500 years. Morocco calls them occupied cities and has demanded their return since independence in 1956. Spain considers the question closed. Both are EU territory and the only land borders between the European Union and Africa. Thousands of people attempt to cross those borders every year, making them flashpoints not just for the bilateral dispute, but for European immigration politics more broadly. Morocco periodically turns up the pressure, allowing migration surges or raising formal claims in international forums. Spain refuses to negotiate. The enclaves remain Spanish. Hans Island. In July 2022, Arctic Ocean. Canada and Denmark finally resolved a dispute that had been running for decades over Hans Island, a barren, uninhabited rock in the Kennedy Channel between Canada and Greenland. They split it in half. It is now the only land border Canada shares with a European country. It is the rare territorial dispute that ended peacefully, a reminder that not every dispute ends in war or permanent stalemate. Some just take 50 years to sort out. The Arctic. As the Arctic ice melts, an entirely new set of territorial disputes is emerging over the seabed beneath the Arctic Ocean. Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States all have overlapping claims to the continental shelf, and whoever controls it controls potentially enormous oil, gas, and mineral deposits, as well as the shipping routes opening as the ice retreats. Russia planted a titanium flag on the seabed beneath the North Pole in 2007. That gesture had no legal effect, but it signaled intent. Since then, all 5 Arctic nations have submitted expanded continental shelf claims to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Several overlap directly. The Arctic is not a war zone today. It may not remain that way. If you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.